And this huma was used by Taoist philosophers and magicians to set forward time for meditation for a variety of reasons. And it was considered one of the superior elixirs of immortality as well. And cannabis does, in fact, it's an antioxidant. And there is indications that cannabis can actually prolong your life. We were speaking about medicine there. Well, people are talking that a lot of the illnesses that we're finding out about nowadays is because people are cannabinoid deficient, and that things like Crohn's disease and other ailments may arise because people are lacking in the natural cannabinoids in their body. And so there's a certain element of preventive medicine that we need to look at with cannabis as well. And as far as longevity is concerned, the oldest woman that ever lived, Phula Nayak in India, she lived to be like 127 years old. And she contributed her long life to her use of cannabis. She smoked it every day and lots of it. Well, lots of evidence for that. So the linguistics for cannabis, the huma got picked up in China. This went into Persia, where it became Heoma in Afghanistan. There's a 4,000-year-old temple the size of a football field that they've discovered in the last 20 years. And half of that temple was dedicated to making the sacred beverage Heoma, which was prepared from cannabis and ephedra. And we know this because they found fossilized imprints of cannabis seeds and residues of THC in the pots and stuff used for making this drink. And the same culture spread into India, and this gave rise to the Indian religion, Hinduism. So it's like spread over there, and then eventually the soma ritual itself, the consecration of cannabis, which made it the soma, was banned, but the use of cannabis ritualistically continued on, particularly in India with the cult of Shiva. And Shiva is the oldest worship god on earth. His worship goes back to the Stone Age, and there's the ritual gatherings in India, like the Kumbh Mela and the Shiva Ratri, which have been going on for 2,000, 2,500 years. And people gather at these events and they drink bong and smoke chillums of hashish, and they've been practicing this ritual gathering for thousands of years, even before the writing of the Bible and whatnot. So, in other cultures it's still existing, and you're still doing this continuing here. Here in the Western world, we were faced with the Dark Ages where so much culture was lost and so much has been forgotten, but and a lot of that has to do with Christianity, and so it's probably a good time to switch into these biblical references. So, the first of the references to cannabosum, these Hebrew references that have been identified as cannabis references by a number of researchers, occurs in Exodus 30:23. And in Exodus 30:23, God is commanded by Moses to make a holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of cannabis mixed with myrrh, cinnamon, into about a gallon and a half of olive oil. Well, it's important to remember that Moses himself first speaks to the Lord in flames of fire from within a bush. So it's kind of an interesting parable. And Moses himself, he only speaks to God when he covers himself in this anointing oil. THC is thought to be fatty soluble, can pass through your organs and through your skin. And he also takes some of this oil and he places it on the altar of incense, and he burns it, probably helped the whole incense burn better. And he actually speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the incense altar. In Hebrew, the pillar of smoke is referred to as the Shekinah, and that represents the physical presence of God in the altar. So the only time that Moses is speaking to God is when he's inside this little enclosed tent-like shelter, and he speaks to the Lord in a pillar of smoke over the incense altar, and is obviously getting some insights from that smoke. And what happens when you throw cannabis into that scenario is it's a real challenge for fundamental religious folk, because it changes the whole scenario of some sort of omnipresent God coming down to earth and commanding Moses to go and kill all the Canaanites and whatnot. And it turns it into an act of shamanism, where a shaman ingests a psychoactive plant, much like is still happening in South America and Africa and places like that to this day. And he interprets those experiences as being some sort of shamanic revelation, and he comes out and says, I question on our problems. This is what the Lord your God has said, And this is the classical agent-world relationship with cannabis, and why it plays a role in so many different religions. Around the same time that Moses, a few centuries after Moses allegedly had his experience at the tent of the meeting, Zoroaster was having the same sort of experience using cannabis beverage banga in Persia, and came up with the Zoroastrian religion, So this has been a common theme throughout the ancient world, and it has a lot to do with the evolution of reflective consciousness, our ability to think and stuff like that. Consciousness does not develop in a vacuum, so you have to have interaction for consciousness to develop. And that interaction goes on far beyond just mere verbal interaction and visual interaction. It's our interaction with our environment. And in our thousands of years relationship with this plant, we've developed these things like cannabinoid receptors in our bodies and our minds and stuff like that, because we've had this indigenous relationship with this plant, and the plant produces them for the same reason, because it's followed us around from settlement to settlement. It's growing in our night soil, our defecation and our urine and near our grave sites and stuff like that. At the same time, the plant's been ingesting us, and so we have this magical, powerful relationship that's with this plant that we're just starting to realize, And it's great that it's appeared at this time in the planet that is such a pivotal time in human history, where so many of our problems, I don't think there's a problem in the world today that we don't have an answer to. It's just a matter of utilizing it. And that's true with cannabis. Like we have legal industrial hemp here, but we haven't seen things like huge hemp fiber factories because there isn't the infrastructure to produce it. So we're still stuck in these old ways. The only thing that's really been taking off is the hemp seed food products, because they don't take quite as much of an infrastructure to produce that stuff. But yeah, it's great to see this plant, and its threat to fundamental religion, I think, is going to be something that we're going to start hearing a lot more about. It's interesting that this whole thing is happening with the Catholic Church right now, and the Pope and child molestation, because the reason I originally bought the Bible was when the Mount Cashel orphanage thing was happening in the 80s, and I was never really brought up with religion, and I was just fascinated by what was going on. I thought these guys are supposed to be all spiritual and holy, and there's all this child molestation going on. And I started reading the Bible, and I couldn't really get much out of it, and started thinking about it. And it's interesting to see the way that these issues come back, just as the cannabis issues starting to take hold, because I really believe that these biblical references are a real threat to the infrastructure of fundamental religion, because of the angle of shamanism. Our shamanic relationship with plants takes a lot of the power out of hierarchies and authorities that claim to have a direct venue to God they alone hold. And these biblical references go far beyond the story of Exodus. In the Old Testament references, there's 4 or 5 of them, and the later ones, the end ones, say at the time of Jeremiah, they're actually anti-cannabis. And what has happened is the Jewish religion moves away from a shamanic kind of tribal cult into this big organized hierarchy, a huge kingdom, and the focus is on things like tithes, how much you pay the temple, what rules and laws we have. And they're not really interested in a lot of like, hey, God just told me that we should, do this, do that. They're more interested in how much you're going to pay. We have a hierarchy here, an infrastructure, and we're just going to manage the ship from here on out. And so it kind of got drove down, but it reemerged in the early Christian period. And the term Christ itself is a Greek word that is a translation of a Hebrew term, the Messiah, that makes reference to the Anointed One, that refers to the same anointing oil that I mentioned earlier. And even in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, John, and whatnot, Jesus doesn't